and I share everything that Ken said in his opening address around altering circumstances by choices. And to be honest with you, Peter, it comes down to does 21st century leadership really look like? We have a continent that in 20 years is going to have 1 billion people in working age, right? And when you look at the Western way that a lot of times the IMF or the World Bank looks at Africa, it's through a Western lens. It's through this MBA lens. And if it's an MBA lens, it's a business lens. And a business lens is a math lens. And when as I've spent the last decade on the continent, what we're looking at is a human lens. We're looking at humanity. We're looking at the soft skills. And the thing that gets really frustrating is that one of the legacies that is in Africa is that money is made in government. Money is not made in business. And this is one of these fundamental structural issues that if we're going to be able to turn Africa from a commodity export network that barely even has inter or intrastate trade, we need to get the money out of government into the business sector and build a transnational export network. Africa has the resources. We all know that. Africa has the people. We all know that. Africa has the demographics. We all know that. But if we don't change some of these foundational things, particularly where money is made in the incentive structure, we can talk about leadership all day, but if we don't have the engine of growth and we're not focusing that towards a comprehensive, basically geoeconomic strategy, right? Instead of looking at politics first, how do we look at putting the economy first and then figure out the rest of the layers? Because if you don't have the economic incentives to grow, and if people can't be happy, healthy, and have an ability to take care of their family, we're not going to get anywhere fast. And as you said rightly, Peter, that window is condensing. We're being pushed behind by COVID and time's ticking. Africa really needs to leapfrog. So with that, thank you.
Return to Gary Whitehill. Gary, when you look at the sectors which are ripe for investment, where would you advise, particularly American investors, where would you advise them to look? Is it agriculture, which is still Africa's biggest employer, or tech, or what kind of areas would you be suggesting?
Peter, that's a great question. And first of all, I'd like to echo what Joan said. I mean, I spend more time with women and women building businesses in the relentless spirit of women on the continent that I do actually men, whether that's North, South, East, West Africa. And it's a great question. One of the challenges that we have, whether it's through the State Department, whether it's through DFC, all of these, or the multilateral aid institutions and things, where do you concentrate your focus, right? We have a finite amount of resources. Now, I'm going to back up for just a second, Peter, and say the first problem we have is that for the most part, for most Americans and for our Defense Department, our security apparatus, and our intelligence agencies, Africa, for the most part, is actually very inaccessible. America does not have a grand strategy for Africa. America in general is not very familiar with Africa. So when you then get into what industries, there's a big issue between functionally what Congress understands or thinks is accessible and what actually happens in the policy layer. There's a structural issue, and they're very divergent. What we have been great at over the years, to be honest with you, to answer your question directly, is healthcare, is education. Obviously, there's tons of opportunity in agriculture, but we have this challenge, particularly in agriculture, and this goes back to my point before about a transnational export network. If we don't start looking at filling institutional voids, like Dr. Patrick said, and looking at those voids as business opportunities and looking at full value chain buildups, right, across any sector. It could be agriculture, it could be, education. We're not going to be successful. And I go back to what I said before on the Western style of how we then look at Africa to give you a tangible example, right? So we have lots of great people with well-intentions who want to educate Africans, right? And I agree with Joan. The internet is a great help. Traditionally, we look at Africa, let's just build schools. Well, nobody goes to school if you don't pay for the air conditioning, because it's just too hot. Well, the electrical grid isn't going to hold that. So you spend all this money building schools when in reality, the opportunity is way over here, a cheap piece of technology. Think about an Amazon Alexa for education. Because the thing is, on top of it, right, we want to teach people in schools. Most Africans can't write, they can't read, but they can speak English and they can speak their native language. So there's a lot of fundamental nuances in what industries we should be working in and how we should be looking at building the full stack market, addressing the institutional voids, and then also adapting it to a local African context based on how, where Africans live, work, and play.
And Gary, I mean, when you're hearing all this, does this open up new opportunities, new ideas for you on just how we get involved? As we said at the outset, the biggest issue facing Africa is the need for jobs and the need to give jobs and dignified jobs to the youth.
Two very important things that I think we are not spent enough time talking about, which is number one, mistrust, which means you can't build bridges till you have trust. And number two is a lot of unresolved trauma. And when you have a lot of unresolved trauma, you make bad decisions, you make quick decisions, you make short-term decisions. And if you look at a lot of what's going on in many different parts of, this whole sphere of Africa, you can bring it back to mistrust and unresolved trauma. I'll promise you, that's the root of a lot of the cultural corruption that then transforms into the financial corruption. And we want to target the financial corruption, and that's not where the ball starts. The ball starts back in the cultural corruption based on what Dee said. When it comes to what Dr. Patrick said, and you brought this up before also, Peter, the question why Blackstone leaves, the question why KKR leaves, right? These are the largest, best resourced private equity firms in the world. Why did they leave Africa? I'll tell you why they leave Africa. It's because they're bankers. And bankers do not understand anything besides efficiency. And bankers don't understand anything besides what they learned in business school. And you land at the airport in Lagos, Nigeria, and I'll promise you, a banker does not understand anything that they literally see with their eyes. And so, you have a very big challenge where the people who are in control of the resources, and this goes back to what I said before, Africa is inaccessible. These are not folks who spent enough time on the continent. They use a normal P&L, and they have a very short time horizon. A 10-year time horizon seems long. That's not long for the level of scale, as Dr. Patrick said, what Africa needs. I've put forward a plan that's a $2.5 trillion geoeconomic strategy for the future of Africa. I've put that towards our defense, military, and security apparatus and said, instead of dropping bombs, instead of securitizing everything, instead of fighting China directly, why don't you build African capacity? So that's one. The other thing real quick is the way to do this. It's not just infrastructure. What needs to be built is a digital infrastructure and investment fund, because you have to start with the digital layer first and supplement it with the sea cables and condense the physical infrastructure. That's something that I've been working on with Pope Francis and some other colleagues for the past 5 years. We started this with the Laudato Si Challenge when the Pope funded 20 different businesses, 4 of which were from Africa, that exuded stakeholder capitalism. And last but not least, the fundamental reason also that businesses don't survive second, third, fourth generation in Africa is because they don't have transnational export networks. There's not enough of the value chain. And on the other side, the reason most public-private partnerships fail is because the way USAID, DFC, they look at a traditional P&L. In Africa, you have to own more of the vertical value chain, or you have to own more of the horizontal market, most likely more on both sides, because there's risk everywhere in Africa. So you can't just build a product or a service or one company. You have to launch with a series of products, a series of services, or multiple companies in multiple industries to diversify the risk. And that's not something we're used to in America, but it's very, very well known in a place like Saudi Arabia, where you have family-led holding companies. And once again, Saudi Arabia, kingdom, Africa, former kingdoms, if we look to Saudi Arabia as an influence for how to structure business, we can learn a lot. Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I don't want to take all the air, but I agree 100% with Joan. I mean, the challenge we have is if we want to transcend past aid in Africa, it's not a one solution or one swath of solutions. And Joan brings up a great point. To do this, we need skilled training. We need certain changes in our immigration laws. We need certain public-private partnerships with universities. I mean, we could build a skilled trade program overnight if we wanted to, bring a whole bunch, let's say 250,000 young Africans to America to learn skilled trade craft, to work side by side, build a joint public-private partnership, bring in some investment, bring those folks back to Africa, build their own businesses and scale those up and build an educational infrastructure and skilled trade infrastructure around it. Why we're not doing it is because that takes 20 different stakeholders across many dimensions. And as I said before, it all goes back to Africa being at the bottom of the list of US's foreign policy agenda, which in my opinion is going to be a large strategic surprise this decade. Unless Africa becomes the #2 foreign policy regional focus of the US this decade, we're going to be in some very deep trouble with what China's doing, not just for us personally, but for also the influence that China will then have regionally against the Middle East and regionally against Europe with what they're doing in North Africa. And we're just completely blind to those types of things. I think Joan's program is exactly the right type of starting point, particularly led by women. Women are the center of community, their local communities in Africa, and we could do that overnight if we were able to push through a bunch of the, let's just call it, hard things that are seemingly unsolvable right now. Thanks.
Does it not become irresistible? I think in the next decade or so, Africa will have the largest population of working age in the whole world, bigger than China, bigger than India. Nigeria, as we know, will overtake USA in terms of its population, rising to 400 million. I mean, Africa's role in the world becomes much more central, surely, as a result of that demographic revolution. Gary, what do you think?
Well, yeah, I mean, look, demographics is destiny. I agree with you 100%, but you have to understand that here we are having a humanities conversation, just like I said before, right? We're having a humanities conversation. We're having a demographic conversation. We all have spent time and understand what it means to be African culture. On the other hand, in the United States, you have people who Africa is inaccessible. You have a defense apparatus that just wants to be warriors instead of strategists. You have an intelligence apparatus that, just like KKR, does not necessarily understand what's going on in Africa. And you have people who are only looking at Africa from a security perspective of China. All of those things, when you combine them, is deep institutional and structural blindness to what needs to be done, how it needs to be done, and the partnerships that can be built overnight if people would just get their hubris and their bias out of the way.